Homang, Charlie Smith, Jongbenji, Georgia Strait. I'm Charlie Smith, editor of the Georgia Strait weekly Vancouver newspaper, and I'm very happy to be back again on WOW TV. This week in the Georgia Strait, we focused a great deal of attention on health and fitness and issues dealing with the body. And one of the stories we had was by our writer Craig Takeuchi, who's to my left, and it concerns a topic called sexual anorexia. And I know that term may confuse some people, so I'm going to get Craig to explain what he meant by that.
Oh, thanks. Yeah, sexual anorexia, it's a condition which is not widely recognized by many psychologists or health researchers. It was coined by an author and sex addiction researcher named Patrick Carnes, and he wrote a book about it. And I came across it by accident when I was researching another topic, asexuality, last year. And sexual anorexia is described as a condition in which a person experiences extreme disgust and aversion to sexual activity, and they in turn starve themselves of sex in the same way that a person who is anorexic severely restricts the intake of food to control their body. And the comparison between the two was made because a sexual anorexic severely restricts their participation in sex. And they both stem from the same issue, which is a need for control. And it's usually a result of a traumatic experience growing up in which they experienced a loss of control, particularly if it has something to do with exposure to sexual information or activity that they didn't feel prepared for. It's a form of, or it's a way to create an artificial boundary between them and the rest of the world to protect themselves. And unfortunately, it leads to a lot of problems that aren't as visible as, say, physical anorexia. Because in physical anorexia, you can see a person's body begin to change, begin to become extremely thin, whereas sexual anorexia, it's very internal, it's very hidden. And one of the characteristics is that if a sexual anorexic has a partner, they might deprive that partner also of sex, and this creates additional stress on the relationship.
This sounds very, very challenging, and it's more than just an issue of sex. It sounds like it's something that's quite deeply rooted, and I'm wondering how psychologists or medical professionals should be addressing something like this. Did you get to that part in your story, Craig?
I interviewed a local counselor who specializes in sex addiction. Her name is Paulette Thomason. And she says the issues are basically the same as in treating sex addiction, which is more widely recognized. Sex addiction is actually the extroverted version, in which a person acts out by becoming very promiscuous, engaging in a lot of sexual activity, whereas the sexual anorexic does the opposite, or they refrain from it. But the root cause is the same, which is a deep-rooted shame and a self-hatred. And in order to address the underlying issues, the issues of self-esteem, self-worth, and the need for control have to be addressed.
I'm wondering if there's anything, like even in terms of people's mental well-being, whether exercise or diet or anything of that nature can help, or is it really, are we really talking about something that requires kind of deep therapy?
Paulette never mentioned anything about like things like exercise or stuff like that, although she did talk about addressing the developmental trauma that a person went through, because that's where the psychological need for protecting oneself sort of comes from. And there are 12-step programs for sex addiction, but there haven't been any similar programs developed for sexual anorexia because it hasn't been properly researched and, or sorry, I should say extensively researched. And it's not as easy to identify as some of the more extroverted behavior that I've talked about.
Yes, this was interesting what Craig did. It's not the only story we had dealing with mental health in the Georgia Strait Healthy Living section, but it was an area that I had never heard about before until Craig brought it to my attention. Another story we had was by Travis Lupick, who you'll be hearing from in a moment. He was looking at the impact of social media on mental health. And one of the things that some people are suggesting is that if you spend too much time on Facebook and involved in social media, that it can actually contribute to a depression. So I'll be asking Travis about that. And the other story we had, which I quite enjoyed, was Carlito Pablo interviewed an artist, Foster Eastman. And Foster Eastman has been doing a big show. He did a show on Mao a while ago. He's doing one about a mural for Afghan veterans of the Afghan War. But he's also doing something called Man Up Against Suicide, and it's a project to get people involved to try to prevent men from committing suicide. And he became interested in this when a friend of his committed suicide. And one of the things Foster Eastman likes to point out is there are many alternatives. Sometimes when people make this terrible choice, it's because they don't think there are any other options. And he wants to get across the point that there are options, even if it's as simple as going to the emergency room or consulting your family doctor or calling the crisis line. There are always options. So this is what Foster Eastman is trying to do, and Carlito Pablo had a story about that this week in the Georgia Strait.